I made a video about tariffs, explaining why they're really bad economic policy because the only thing that they're guaranteed to do is raise prices for US consumers and lead to retaliation against US producers, especially if the tariff is a 20% blanket import tax, like which is what Trump proposed. Well, I got a lot of pushback in the comments basically saying that I didn't care about the American worker. Now, the point of tariffs, and this logic is incredibly appealing, but the point of tariffs is to make it harder to produce goods in other countries so that you produce those goods at home. And yeah, that could raise costs and make it pricier for US consumers, but we've raised revenue through tariffs, so we can offset it through the income tax system. Like this is worth it to bring jobs back. Like I said, I understand the appeal. It sounds really nice. Unfortunately, it's just not that simple of a story in real life, and that can be unsatisfying to hear. But sometimes economic policy has to be about doing the right thing, not the easy thing, if you want to accomplish the task. Tariffs would not be very good at bringing jobs back to the United States. So I want to make a few points about this. Number one, for all the talk about bringing jobs back, retaliation against US producers mean that you are risking jobs that we currently have. I think what's lost in this conversation so much is that this we have manufacturing employment. It's not as high as it used to be. Manufacturing employment in the US peaked in 1979. But it's not as if those workers don't matter, and jeopardizing their export markets doesn't have any other type of cost. I mean, we're basically putting at risk all of the workers who currently work in production that is exported for the possibility of having new workers that don't currently exist for new kind of domestic production. That is a really high risk because retaliation is almost impossible to predict. I mean, we think of this trade relationship as there's the US and there's China and we trade with them and that's it. But you need to multiply that by like 100 because there's lots of countries that we trade with. And retaliation doesn't just have an effect on one country, it can have an effect on multiple countries and multiple goods. And we're risking a lot for our current producer base for a potential worker that we don't have already. Now, again, you could say that would be worth the cost to have more manufacturing here. But, in absolute number terms, maybe the biggest argument against tariffs is that it's just a really ineffective and expensive way to go about it. Researchers at the University of Chicago looked at the washing machine tariff that Trump instituted in 2017. And what they noted is that given the increase in cost of consumers and other economic effects, each job that was created from this washing machine tariff cost about $800,000. If you want to bring jobs back to the US and you have $800,000 per job to throw around, you could do it in a lot more effective, direct way than what you would get from a tariff. That's probably the biggest argument against them, is just how ineffective they are relative to their cost. But what I thought was really interesting is in the washing machine study from Chicago is that they found an effect that maybe wasn't predicted, which is that the price of dryers went up too. Dryers weren't affected by the tariff, right? So I'm a seller. I sell imported washing machines and dryers. Okay, so now the washing machines get more expensive because I have to pay an import tax on them, but I sell them as a pair. So if I have to make washing machines 5% more expensive, you know what? I'm going to make dryers 5% more expensive, which is exactly what they did. They raised the cost of dryers, even though dryers weren't subject to the import tax. This is the type of like unintended but myriad and diffuse consequences that come from tariffs. So that's why as a policy on its own, it's really not worth it. Now, I think for the trickiest argument, what about trying to bring manufacturing jobs back to the US? There is something to be said for how easy the inverse seemed. That when we had manufacturing here, we lowered the gate, opened ourselves up for free trade, and then the jobs went away. So it should be as easy as just lifting the gate back up again. But there was more than going on to manufacturing employment in the US than just trade. In particular, there were two things. One is automation. In a lot of industries, more jobs were lost to automation than they were to trade, but it's, you've got a lot of like easy fall guys of like, we can blame every job lost in manufacturing for the past 60 years on free trade agreements, even though we know automation played a big role in that as well. And automation occurred well before AI and all kinds of, it's called AI now. There was automation, there's technical change, becoming less labor intensive as a manufacturer has been called a lot of things over time, but it contributes as much, if not more, to manufacturing job loss than trade does. The other thing to keep in mind is that the US has relatively expensive workers. Now, it might not feel that way to you. You might not feel that you're very high paid, but compared to other countries, it's more expensive to make things here in part because the labor force costs more. Well, you can either be really upset about that and say, well, I still want manufacturing in the US to look like it did in 1955. Or you could take that on its face and say, okay, we're more expensive workers. So if we're going to have manufacturing in the US, it's going to be really high end manufacturing that requires a highly skilled manufacturing workforce that we can be competitive on here. This is the difference between trying to recreate the past and wanting to build the future. Just in putting up a 20% import ban or an import tax, y'all, that's fighting for a past that we will not get back. We're not going to have manufacturing employment like we did in 1955. We didn't have it in 1970, we didn't have it in 1980, and we won't have it now. There's too many factors at play. If we want to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States, then we need to do it strategically, and we need to do it with the assumption that our workers cost more and that they should cost more because they're American workers and they're awesome, and not trade away, low wage jobs that are simply not sustainable here. So this is the kind of final reason why I think tariffs are so ineffective as a policy. If you're going to spend $800,000 per job, let's put it in a job that we know is viable here. I think in some ways this is what was so effective about the Chips and Science Act, was that these are very, kind of technologically advanced manufacturing facilities. They require a very highly skilled workforce. It's something that American workers can do, but we didn't have much of a base of either knowledge, skills, or industrial activity to do it here. So that's what the Chips and Science Act invested in. And of course, it came with import restrictions to protect this nascent domestic industry. So if that's the type of jobs we want, then we need to find high end industries that we can protect in their infancy to make sure that we're competitive for the future, so we don't have to have so much manipulation through trade policy to protect our jobs here because we are competitive. I mean, I think the same thing goes for the production of electric vehicles. Biden didn't, get rid of Trump's tariffs. In fact, he added one for Chinese electric vehicles that tend to cost a lot less than the electric vehicles made in the United States. But if electric vehicles are the future, we should invest in making them here. And that's more than just a tariff, right? That was a full-scale industrial policy to support the manufacturing and sale of electric vehicles so that the future is made here. And that's what I think that's the whole point. Maybe I should have just said that at the beginning. We don't want to make the past here. We want to make the future. If you want to make the future, you're not just throwing around tariffs. You're constructing really well thought out industrial policy.